Thank you for tuning in to episode. Oh, fuck. Thank you for tuning in to the World Builder's Anvil, episode 296. It's time to build the Mystratos culture.
Don't know where to start building your fantasy world?
Do you need more? Does it make sense?
Forget any worries and become a crafter of imagination.
This is the place where we will prime your mind.
Now, it's time to heat up the forge.
Break out the mithril ingots and hammer.
Welcome to the World Builder's Anvil. I'm Jeffrey W. Ingram.
And I'm Michael Miller.
Let's sup from the muck of Java and build. Welcome back. Pretty mouthed as always. My name is Jeffrey W. Ingram.
Was that to me, that sounded like you said pre-mouthed. So did you mean pretty mouthed?
Pretty mouth. I kind of shifted off my microphone, so it was
pretty mouth.
Probably bad timing to move my head away from my singer-style microphone.
Gotcha. And mouthful of words, I am Michael Miller.
Okay. Today we're going to actually do a bit about the culture building. And for those of you who are newer to the show, the way I roll with culture in the ideal setting when I'm just kind of rolling with something is I need to know a bit about where they live, the area, the environment they're in. We talked a little bit about that in the last two episodes. A lot in the city episode, we talked about one specific city they lived in. We'll talk a little bit more about the geography here because that does play into some of the cultural things.
I would say it's a huge factor if you just generically start listing off different geographical areas. You say desert, there's people that live in the desert. You know their culture is going to be focused very differently than people that live on the Great Plains or people that live in the mountains.
And exactly, almost definitely. But obviously, where people live have a massive impact on who they are, and a bit about who they are. As a people. So what makes them up? What are their attributes? Because that will tell you how they interact with what's around them, or maybe lead you towards certain types of things. And this doesn't mean much on Earth, but especially, you talk about a fantasy world where you have cultures that have different strengths, different intelligences. When you have different types of attributes like that in your races, the way they interact with the world around them will be different. Some race with a very low IQ is going to be very animalistic in the way they behave, where, the higher the IQ, hopefully the more academic in stature they are. Hopefully they don't use it for evil. Not like academia has ever been used for evil.
Oh, come on, Jeff. Name one time.
There's not one time that happened.
There's not one time.
That's right. There's not one time where people have used academia for bad.
There's many times.
All the times, yes. Anytime you can make something sound plausible with big words, it's a way to go. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more broadly. In 294, I think we talked about the city of Mystere, and it's on an island on top of a plateau. Not temperate climate, but closer to temperate due to elevation. But if you go off of the plateau, essentially the area they lived in is ringed in mountains, kind of like West South America, but it's not quite as narrow. It's not a narrow strip of land. It's actually a sizable chunk of land that's kind of cut off from the rest of the continent by very rugged mountains. So they're relatively tall.
So they're a mountain people.
Well, in part, but now, and there's a few clusters of mountains without two. But now, if you come down off of the mountains into the plain area to the east, which is where the Mystratos live, it is rainforest. With clusters of highlands mixed in. So you have lots of rivers, and I'm thinking like the way I thought about when I was constructing it was kind of like, have you ever seen the pictures of China where they have like the extreme mountain canyons where the water kind of cuts through it with rivers?
Mm-hmm.
It's sort of like that, but in the Amazon.
See, that's what in my head, I was picturing like them having built around like an Amazon forest sort of thing. Cause you had the streets that were canals. So that's what I was envisioning. So now you're talking about mountains. That kind of threw me for a second.
Yes. The mountains play part of it, but And they also have some of the Gardula is not a volcanic heavy world. Like it's not nearly as volcanically active as Earth.
Mhm.
But this is one of the few regions where they have a lot of active volcanoes. So it actually adds in. Now, because of the mixture of highlands and lowlands, you have lots of marsh areas. During the rainy season, you have massive areas that will
Big
completely flood.
Yeah.
And so you have there are different humans and elf tribes in the area that aren't Mystratos, even though their cultures are somewhat similar. And their languages sound very similar, to someone who's not from the area. Okay. The new enzyme. That's awesome.
Just cut all this out. What I was showing you is me turning the volume down on my ringer because I hadn't done it yet. So I must have.
I actually talked about it, but you would have known that if you had listened to me.
I try not. Do you know?
Yeah, I know.
That
That's like me listening to you. That's
at all costs.
What's the point of that?
All right, so please cut all this out, Jeff.
Probably
if you're listening, Jeff, if you're editing right now, Jeff, please cut this out.
I'll probably just cut the part you asked me to cut it out, and I'll say I left it in because of you. I'll leave this in for you, Mike. Okay.
Michael.
Touche. Okay. Now, there are some things to it. I found some of the few notes that I have on the Mystratos here, and there's a couple elements we need to talk into. We're not going to go heavily into the base 105 number system, but we'll talk a bit about it. They actually have a martial art that they use. It's sword based, and we'll talk a bit about that and why it's important. I have I have some details about them. I actually have two languages. One's a derivative language. Actually, I have two derivative languages. I don't actually have it sketched out what the actual language is. They cluster. They're very syllable based language, even though they have phonics. They do have an alphabet. You don't get that through looking at their words. Now they've come up with what I like to call a demonic type of script, which is probably a mispronunciation, but there was actually a bastardization of hieroglyphics that came about because hieroglyphics are really hard to write. And so they kind of came up with their own sort of shorthand version. So it's easier to write out. So some things go in that, but any official writing would have to be in the proper language. So unofficial stuff, letters between people, would go into an alphabet that they have. And then the proper language is all symbolic. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we talk a bit about that. You have to understand they have 2 seasons because they're tropical. They live in a tropical zone. They have a wet and a dry season. But they look in the world in a series of threes. There's 3 major bodies in the night sky that are important to them. There's 2 moons. One's very small and can only be seen when it's eclipsing the sun or the other moon. More than likely the other moon, because it's kind of hard to look at and see a small object if the sun's behind it. So you have to have good vision that you want to lose to look at that. But in theory, you could see it because it's a darker rock. So it doesn't reflect light. It absorbs light. So it's actually warmer than the bigger moon.
I didn't know you had 2 moons.
I had 2 moons. You just don't see them. Because like I said, one is small. And you pretty much only see it. It's a very special occasion for most cultures that look at the night sky when you have the little dot on the big, the little black dot on the big white moon, essentially. Now, a few things to keep in mind is we talked a bit about the creation story. And it was essentially how Mystere was slaughtered by her children and sacrificed. Her blood was used to essentially fertilize the earth so they could grow grain to eat. And that is the essential grain of the area, even though there are more types of grain than that. It's sort of like the mother grain, I guess you'd call it. But it leads to blood sacrifice being an important role, not necessarily human sacrifice, but blood sacrifice. Sometimes you sacrifice a whole being, and once again, we should also mention when we talk about human sacrifice, it's just using an earth term. It's any sentient being sacrifice. So it could be an elf, it could be a human. They have some important time frames as well too.
Here's an important question culturally. Blood sacrifice and or sentient being sacrifice is important to them, but is it more important than their own people? And subsequently, do they sacrifice their own people? Or will they only sacrifice people that are not Mystratos?
They will sacrifice Mystratos, and we'll actually get a little bit into that when we talk about the important periods of time.
Okay.
And we talked about a little bit before, seasons are important. They don't really, days are naturally happen, but they don't have anything like months. Even though they watch the moons, they don't track months. For them, it's too short of a period of time. The shortest period of time they look at are what they call the seasons. They say they have 3 seasons, but really one centered around the wet season, one centered around the dry season, and there's some periods of time where it's kind of in between. So technically it's 4, but they consider the in-between time as 1 season, even though it's 2 different periods of time. So they have what they call 3 seasons. Even though really they have 2 seasons.
One of them comes up more often and they just say, oh, that's
exactly. And it's a little shorter. Overall, it's the same amount of time, though. They're all 121 days. And if you multiply those 3 together, you get minus the point difference. You get a year, 1 revolution. Now, every 10 years, they have what they call a Sunday, S-U-N day.
Yeah, no, I get it. I get it.
Yeah. And it's their leap year. So once every 10 years, they do it on the brightest day of the year because you get more sun that year because there's an extra day. Yes. The summer equinox or solstice. Equinox is spring, fall. I think solstice is summer, winter. Equinox is solstice.
Fall. Yeah, I think you're right.
Yeah. And then beyond that, there's some other important periods of time. So there's a 10-year block that's important because of the leap year, which gives you your sun festival. And then every 2,836 years, the sun eclipses the nebula. There's a big nebula in the night sky. It's purple, but the sun is centered in between it. And you can't see it because the sun would be out during this event, but it's technically they're lined up. And the Mystratos actually track this. This is the end of their greater cycles. It's kind of like their version of a century is about 3,000 years. And it's essentially about 10 generations of people at the average lifespan, but not quite. But it's based off of this calendar. And then over there, over top of that one, every 9 of those is essentially a super version. And now the thing is, when you have this lining up, it creates really havoc weather on Gardul for the year. So think on Earth like it's the year you have really bad El Niños. You have your worst hurricanes. This is that year. Now you might have bad years in between, but this year in particular, you're going to have really bad weather. And places that are dry will be drier. Places that are wet, it'll be wetter. It's just the way it rolls. And if it's shifting, a wet place will start to become drier than normal this time of year, and then it'll start to shift and become drier over time. But essentially, this period of time is a really, really bad year. Now, this is essentially my version of their new cycle happening. And now what happens is when the new cycle begins, much like the Mayan calendar, right, where you have the cycles, if you're an emperor, if you cannot control it, you will actually be sacrificed. Yes.
How many times has that happened?
We'll say once. It's rare. I mean, in general, the emperor is actually the religious head as well too. But typically they believe, and so the thing is, if it gets to a point where it's so bad that they think it's all coming to an end, an emperor, in theory, can be sacrificed. Now they have long lives, so in this period of time, you probably have 20 some emperors. You know, if they have a full long life, 20 to 30 emperors. You know, in this greater cycle thing. Many more generations of younger people.
Another quick question on emperors: are they ever usurped, and how is succession handled?
Succession is handled. It's typically to the oldest child.
Okay, so it is more like a royal family.
It's most definitely a royal family. There are of course usurpations and stuff like that. They're a little less common because elves have longer memories. So a lot of times, if you overthrow a royal family, the people just don't trust you. And it's kind of like, when the Normans conquered England, it took them a couple generations before the English felt like the Normans were their rulers. Same thing here, but instead of it being, 60 years, you're now looking at, 60 to 100 years, you're looking at
1,000,
probably at least 1,000 years of unrest. It can happen if you have a bad emperor specifically, it can happen. But now, in theory, being the religious head, family members can kind of be excommunicated. So, like, if you're older, if the emperor feels like their oldest kid is an idiot, and by that it could be many different things. But for whatever reason, if they want to, they can learn, they can like unadopt without murdering, which is nice, I guess. Now, don't get me wrong; it probably ends up with people being murdered too. But
well, in that case, would he try to have one of his other children become the next emperor?
Oh, of course. Okay. Usually you try to keep it in the family. Well, there have probably been occasions, very rarely, where they've picked someone outside of their family and adopted them in. Sort of like in the Roman custom, sort of like in the century of the 5 good emperors. You had that period of time in Rome, like 100 to 200 AD. It ended obviously when the last guy decided to make his son the next emperor, and then you got a crazy Nero-like emperor. If you want more on that, watch the movie Gladiator, because that would be the guy who ended the period of the good emperors in Rome. But it's very important to keep in mind that in theory, it doesn't have to be a family member, but usually it is, and there's somewhat of an egotism with emperors that think that something about their blood makes them right to rule. But the interesting thing is, though, it's pretty much universally accepted that if you are unadopted, you lose your claim, on the throne, and there are no occurrences of people gaining a claim on a throne and taking the empire for themselves once they've been unadopted. It's a pretty bad thing to have happen to you. Now, I actually have the Syrian language, which actually I didn't realize was going through my old notes that I'd taken in my notebooks. And actually found I've actually created the Syrian language. So I might share this one. It's interesting because it breaks, their alphabet is broken down into blocks. And essentially those blocks, the way the shapes are formed on them sort of tell you the hidden pattern in Mystratos hieroglyphs. They look like hieroglyphs, but there are small shapes in them that will actually say what the letter, the sound that goes with it is. They will have multiple blocks. Usually their words have 3 to 4 syllables, and each block has a sound. So a full hieroglyph is one word. But it's phonetically spelled on there, but you have to know the language really well, because usually people get distracted by the picture. So if you'd have, like, talking about the emperor and what happened during his reign, there'd be a hieroglyph for an emperor, which would have a male or female face on in the middle with a headdress that looked like an emperor that everyone would see. But in the border around it, there would be actual shapes woven into it. That actually informs you of how it's spoken, how you say the word. So it's one of those things where if this language had been lost, it would be really hard to relearn it. And the other thing that helps too is Siren. One of the Mystratos colonies was in Syrian land. And I call it Syrian land, but it's tribal land. So they had some cities set up in the tribal lands where the Syrians were all around them. They traded with them. The Syrians' alphabet is based off of them trying to learn the Elven alphabet. They created their own, so their sounds have similar shapes in them. So it's sort of like there's additional sounds that don't exist in the Elven language, but and they've sort of adopted their own same style, but it's all the alphabets are just squares with like different shapes in them. And it's kind of a cheater's guide to what the Elven alphabet would look like. Not the shorthand version. And they obviously don't build theirs in squares. So yeah, they build theirs more like a written alphabet. So now let's talk a bit about the culture, right? Their major building materials are stone and wood. And now one of the misconceptions, at least I had as a kid, and I don't know if it's something that is different now. I always thought tropical woods were sort of crappy because you see palm trees and you kind of think of that as tropical woods. It's completely the farthest from the truth. Typically, some of the hardest woods on Earth come from tropical rainforest.
I was about to say that. That's very true.
Yeah. So that could have been my lack of woodworking knowledge or maybe a poor education. I don't know. But wood is significantly important too, especially the hardwoods. Like your ebony style woods, your mahoganies.
And if you care at all to get into it and look into it, there is an absolutely staggering amount of different types of wood out there. And the only reason that I've recently become aware of some of the stuff that's out there is from making knife handles. Because what a lot of the knife makers will do is they'll make a nice knife and make it a point to get handle scales, which is a pre-cut size of wood, a small quantity of wood. So you might get literally only a piece that's like 2 inches wide by 6 to 8 inches long and only a quarter inch to a half inch thick or maybe a little more. And they'll get these and it might be very expensive for just that little quantity of wood. But there's an absolute staggering number of different woods out there. And if you start working with some of these, oddball woods from other countries, you also have to learn how those woods behave in your weather conditions, like where you live, in your humidities. And because some woods can be, what's the word? Not toxic, but irritants to the skin. So you need to make sure to seal them appropriately. Some can be irritants as you're sanding it. You're making powder, so it's flying in the air. The sawdust, the sanding dust, and that can be an irritant. So there's so many things to learn and know. And those tropical woods they're tough stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, most definitely. But the major materials that are at hand and used are wood, sort of palmy style leaves.
Got to be a lot of thatched roof.
A lot of thatched roofs. I mean, those tropical leaves in some of those trees, especially your palm trees here, are very, very good at making roofs.
I think I've mentioned this before when I traveled through Puerto Rico. I didn't actually do anything in Puerto Rico. I just was laying over to fly somewhere else. And the airport, it was a hangar. I walked through an airport hangar and it was a thatched roof. I mean, it must have been 40, 50 feet high. So you'd think it would be all like flattened steel, like corrugated steel roof or something like that. But no, it was all thatch. I was like, wow, this is weird, because the whole rest of the building was built like a normal commercial building, but the roof was all thatched.
Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, and I remember you have mentioned that before, but it's great to bring up, and I'd never thought about that, but yeah, I mean, it makes sense, and
it's what they got.
It's what they got, unless you want to spend the cash to bring in other materials that you don't have at hand.
Ship in all the shingling.
One of the things to keep in mind is in most cultures where status exists, and this culture not being any different than most, with a very rigid hierarchy of classes. In here, emperors and stuff will have materials that aren't common or hardly used, because they can afford to have them shipped in. The richer you are, the more of this stuff that you have. Now they do use some iron, some metal, not in weapons typically. Sometimes if a weapon's gifted to them, they don't forge weapons. There are some of the people that do forge, but it's like you might have an iron ringlet. Iron's not very common where they're at, so it's actually a very valuable thing to have an iron. Like a noble might have an iron circlet or something, just because it's rare, and they don't have the big forgeries that most of the other countries do.
So I imagine do they use bow and arrows?
They use bow and arrows.
So I imagine stone tips.
Obsidian is the preferred. Bone. Obsidian is the preferred. They do have sort of the Aztec style swords where they have the wooden plank with jagged obsidian.
Yeah. Oh, those things are nasty.
Those things are nasty. And the truth be told is the reason you don't move away from that is, one, they can kill you, but they're not designed to. They're designed to maim you. Because the mark of a good Aztec warrior and a good Mystratos warrior is bringing back prisoners. That takes more skill, and prisoners can be sacrificed. So bringing back prisoners is actually the goal if they go to war with you, not to kill you. They will kill you, but if they don't come back with a lot of prisoners, it's embarrassing. I killed 800,000 people. I'm so embarrassed. I'm so embarrassed right now.
Take a look at did we do a because all this is familiar? Didn't we do a cultural deep dive on the Aztec or the Mayan?
We probably talked about them intermittently. I'm sure. I don't think
I would love to be able to say what episode it is, but we talk about this very thing.
Yeah, we must have. I wouldn't have.
We definitely did.
It's something that really fascinates me. A lot of stonework is very important in the area too. A lot of ornamentation involves with like gemstones as well too. Like one of the things that really kind of sent me down this path was around the time I was building the culture originally. I got an Aztec art book or a Mesoamerican. I'm not sure if it was strictly Aztec. And there was a beautiful jade death mask, and it just looked so good. It's like it hooked me into the frame of thought to bring in some of the elements from there, and then kind of do my thing with them. Clasps, I generally are probably tie off type of things. They don't have too many metal clasps at this point. I don't want to get too much in the thing. We've talked about the architecture a lot in the episode on cities in 294. And I don't want to really spend too much more time on that right now. If you want to know a little bit about the architecture, it's very Mesoamerican based, where you build essentially a stone foundation, and over time you can build stuff on it. And then over time, if you need more, you actually build it up. And so over time, they're mirroring the mountains. And that's one of the reasons why they do it is the mountains aren't where they live, but they're so dominant to where they started that anywhere they build a city, they're recreating the mountains. And that's why they have the big pyramids. And because it's sort of tying back. And remember, it's the way the universe is, like the planet you live on is probably the peak of a plateau in the universe. So that's just the way they roll. But it's really important to keep in mind, though, we talked about a temple where there's a tree, and it'd be a very hardwood, sort of like an ebony wood kind of tree that kind of grows up the middle, very tall. And they actually, as it grows, they add more levels to the temple to surround it, so only the top portion of the tree comes out. And they do that because Mystere had the qualities of a tree. And so essentially the tree of life, it's the symbolic tree of life for the community. All Mystratos communities have this temple. Not all cities in the area or all towns have a tree of life at the middle, but you can tell that they're Mystratos if they have this temple at the middle. And then around that temple will be another temple representing heaven, representing hell, and the basic universal structure from the core part of the town in the Mystere building episode. But it's that core part of the town becomes the central plaza, and you'll have many plazas around two of other temples. They won't be laid out like this one, but every city has this sort of at the middle of the city is essentially a generic breakdown of the universe. Just as a reminder, I guess. It's the way they roll in Mystere lands.
I feel like we're spending a lot of time covering things that you already have established, and we're not doing a lot of building. Are there specific things that you want to get to start building?
We've been talking about materials and clothing and stuff like that. The big thing to keep in mind is their martial art. They have this martial art, and I forget how to pronounce the word.
You have a name for it?
There's a name for it, but essentially it stands for sword dancing.
Mm-hmm.
And but the point of it is, and you're the optimal provider, is if you get into your sword dance and you're a master, obviously, you can literally hypnotize people around you. They just become sort of paralyzed and watching you. It's supposedly very beautiful to watch, but as they're doing it, they're going around chopping legs.
I was about to say, I think this is also something really important to note. If you've got a culture that has a martial art, specifies in a type of weapon, which they do, and makes it a point to maim, not kill sentient beings, so they can bring back lots of survivors, prisoners to sacrifice, that would lean to them knowing physiology really well.
Oh yeah.
So
they know what hurts people. They know what distracts people.
But they also know what will hurt without killing. And I think that's an important thing to know. That lends to them having good medical ideas.
Good medical ideas and good education for their warriors.
Exactly.
Their warriors are uneducated ruffians.
I mean, but they also might not be super good about medicine themselves. It might just be like, okay, you need to hit here and not so deep. If you hit here even lightly, you'll kill.
We don't care how to cure the common cold.
Right. We just want to avoid killing until we get them back to camp.
Until later. Until dinner time. Later. I'm sorry, they don't cannibalize much.
I'm just saying that came to mind that they would have to have some medical knowledge out of necessity to avoid killing.
Yeah. Another important thing is to keep in mind too is stone's important. So if people have stone artwork, stone art, I forget what they call them, art displays. I forget there's a word for it in decorator television shows. The shows I watched. Installations. Thank you. Yeah, it probably came to me. That shows they're poor. The thing is, the more unique, iron, silver is more common of a metal than gold. They're also easier to manipulate than iron too. Types of become famous dyes are important as well too. For 2 points, they do get this idea of their military buildings are camouflaged, much like they are because of their appearance, as we talked about before. So like an outpost would be painted so it would be disruptive in the jungle. It would be hard to see. If you took it and put it anywhere else, it would look ridiculous. But on the other hand, their cities are the opposite. They're covered in limestone, so they're bright white. And a few parts will be painted, but typically it's just like very bright. white is sort of the thing. Kind of what people think anthens look like is actually more what their structures look like, because they essentially create a plaster from lime and they cover all of the structures in it, so they look really impressive. But without getting more into that, but a bit in customer good wise, there's lots of spices that come out of here. Some gemstones travel in and out. They import in not much food. They have lots of food too. So essentially, the main things that they import in are luxury goods from other areas. Wine, which they don't make, it does get imported in. Other types of unique things that you just don't find in their areas. That's typically what gets imported in. They have a lot of food, and they have a lot of the materials that they use. Like obsidian is hard to get anywhere else. They typically don't export obsidian because it's so important to them, both religiously and militarily. It's super sharp stuff. In case you do not know, obsidian is one of the sharpest things on Earth if you know how to chip it correctly. It can cut most anything. Now it's a bit brittle, but you still don't want to. If an obsidian arrowhead hits you, it's probably worse for you than having a metal one. So keep that on. But skill wise, it's harder to create obsidian tips than it would be to forge a bunch of arrowheads for. So in a way, it becomes important to recover that kind of stuff after a battle.
Think of it like dragon glass.
Now, one of the other things that sort of complicates them, these are complicated people. They have a long time. So it's like they have a number system where I said it's a base 105 system, which is complicated enough. 106 is 1, which is a single little dot, and 105 right next to each other. But here's the other thing that complicates it. When they have tablets for accounting or for numbers purposes, they're grids. And so they're...
No, to be clear, like stone tablets.
Like they
not to be confused with iPads.
Yeah, not to be confused with iPads. Very fair. They'll have tablets made out of stone, which they carve numbers into, for permanent remembering of the numbers. But they have 3 columns in there, or 3 squares, and then they stack the squares next to each other. And so you'll have these squares where it's like 1, 3, and 2. And 3, the middle square, the 3 squares I call it, is the sun square. And then you have the little moon and the big moon that surround the sun. So in this 106 base number system, when you write out numbers, if you put a 1 in that 3 slot, which is the middle slot, and I don't know why I'm telling you the numbers, it would just be confusing, but if in that middle square you put a 1, that's like saying tens. The first square is like saying 100. I'm sorry, that's like saying hundreds in the middle. Tens is to the left and ones are to the right. So the little moon are your ones, your big moon is your tens, and then the middle, the sun, is your hundreds. But so instead of having to write like 100, and really meaning 107 or 106, it would just literally be blanks across the board, because the number 0. Actually, no, it would not. It would you would just put the number 1 in in the middle, top left middle quadrant. So it's this very complicated system, and I'll put some examples of numbers up. I'll create something to throw up there, a couple of different examples, because we go 10. For us, we have a system where we build upon. Their system doesn't work that way, but because of it, you can actually put a lot. Each of these cubes themselves can count up to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 times 106, plus tens, plus ones, because each square is broken down into 12 units. For people who aren't used to the number system, myself included, it's complicated because you would think like in our system to write 100 is 1 with 2 zeros after it. We add on, and there is some of that in their language when you're writing it down in a passage. But when you do a formal written number system, when you're writing the numbers down for posterity, it goes on to these 1, 3, large moon, sun, little moon, squares. And so a 1 on the little moon would mean 1. A 1 on the sun square would mean 106. The 1 on the large moon would mean 10. And it's all of their stuff is purposely complicated. It would take hundreds of years, or for this, it would probably take a decade or so to really master their number system. And I'm exaggerating, but it still would take a long time because the way you write it is different than the way you write it formally is different than the way you use it written down in a sentence, which is different than the way you would speak about it. And their whole life is complicated like this, but it makes it very hard. Like a human, if they came in and captured a bunch of elven warriors, would not live long enough to be able to master the sword dancing, to be able to use it to hypnotize people. They wouldn't have enough time, and the elves wouldn't know how to teach it to them any faster. They would want to try, and because it's, in a way, think about it, it's very powerful, right? You could have, in a human thing, you have one soldier doing this, and all the other soldiers killing people. So
well, I assume that's what they do.
Yes, very much so. That is what they do. If they would learn, but they don't remember. For them, as they're doing the dance, they're chopping people's legs to cripple them, and then they're once they're incapacitated, they're dragging them off to go back to temple for possibly the worst religious experience of their life. But yeah, a few other things to keep in mind too, linguistically as they speak. Like I said, syllables are very important. They build their alphabet into syllables and then they speak. But I don't know. I don't want to go too much into the language. I think that's a whole different thing. But essentially, they have a few different patterns where you'll see either a consonant, vowel, consonant, a consonant, vowel, or a consonant, vowel, consonant, vowel, or a consonant, vowel, vowel, consonant. Okay. That's a real shorthand for people who care. And if you don't care, you won't know what that means, and it doesn't matter. Okay. I haven't really fully fleshed out their language either. That would be several episodes. It takes a couple weeks to really, and theirs would take longer because it's so complicated. I don't know if I'll ever actually do theirs. Their number system took long enough. So, the thing is, are there any questions that you have that you'd want to know about the Mystratos culture?
Me?
Yeah.
Well, yeah. I mean, what kind of food do they eat? As far as their religious worship goes, like we could get much more into that.
Yeah.
Like, obviously we know that there are sacrifices, but that's all we've really covered. You've mentioned that the emperor is also their religious leader. I'd like to know how he proceeds over the religious ceremonies. Like all of these things I would find interesting.
Okay. So,
start with the food. I think that's really important.
So essentially,
I mean, you'd say rainforest, so that gives us an idea of what's available.
And of course, remember where their lead city's from is on a lake. So there's a lot of fungus types of food available to them there that isn't available necessarily broadly everywhere else. And especially because of their altitude, it's a little different, which is actually kind of nutritious stuff itself. Plus, they have essentially, we're going to call it corn here, but it's their primary grain, which is what the god has brought to the world to create life, to feed life. Those become their two staples. Largely, their diets are grain-based, supplemented by hunted meat. They don't do a lot of or really they don't do any. It's just like you don't have good grazing lands where they live, so there's very little if with spices, because spices are plentiful. Peppers and gums and all kinds of stuff naturally occur all around them. Like literally, gum grows on tree. You can pick it off and just chew it. You probably have to process it first. I don't really know much about gum, but it's the land of chocolate. There's coffee. This is a land of wondrous foods that most of the world does not get to partake in, which is unfair, which is why big, trade routes are important. So you can get coffee.
Now, what about,
but most meat, let me make sure I cover this point.
Sure.
Most meat comes from game. They don't raise animals. There just isn't a lot of land. It's not part of their culture to raise animals. So the meat that they eat is hunted. They don't have cows. They don't have pigs. They don't have chickens. If they do, they get them from the wild. There's a little bit in the wild where they like lizards and stuff like that they harvest for meat. But in general, most of the meat that is eaten, most of the popular meat is all hunted.
Yeah, I would assume that there would be a great deal of animals, just because when you're talking rainforest, you're talking tons of different animals and insects too.
Oh yeah, no, they would also eat insects, not necessarily a lot, but there's some grubs in general are typically very nutritious. That would typically probably be more poor people food. Oh, look, we found a whole area of grubs. Let's dig it up and get the grubs out so we can mix it in with our gruel. The richer people have time to either go hunting or to have people hunt for them. So they'll get like meat brought to them, or they can trade for dried goods from elsewhere. Lots of game hunted for, but they don't raise very much, if at all. And mostly it's like, think of, they have some iguanas, maybe also a few iguana farmers, just because the joke, if you travel to the Caribbean, is iguana is their chicken. So I heard that on a couple different places, I think in both Belize and in was it Honduras? I think it was Honduras, the island of Rotan. They both had that kind of joke that, it's our chicken. So be careful eating what they tell you is chicken if you're overseas, because it might be iguana. But then again, a lot of people eat it, so it's probably good. Now, as for what was something else that you were interested in there?
Like the religion and how the emperor rules and how he also presides over the religion.
Okay, so he is the technical head of the church, but he's not like a representative of God. He's not like they don't worship him as a walking god. No, he's not a god king.
God king, that's the term my brain was looking for, but I couldn't find.
He is not a god king, but he's essentially essential to keeping the gods at bay. And remember, their gods are the types of gods who murder their own mother.
So you don't want them hanging around, is the point.
You don't want them hanging around. Dealing with the gods is an essential thing at times. There's probably, in their pantheon of gods, there's probably a couple who, like the one who brings you food, the harvest, is a good guy. But in general, their gods make Greek gods look like they're pansies. Not very vicious. But in general, most people, and this is sort of true throughout the ancient world, you interact with your gods through festivals. So in festivals, you make sacrifices to the gods. And this is one of the misconceptions, right? You burn your offerings typically to gods, and then you eat the things that are left behind. You don't just burn the meat forever. If you burn a goat, the meat is typically eaten by the people who are at the festival.
Mm-hmm.
It's the smoke is for the gods. That's how they get their side of it.
I kind of like that. No waste.
Exactly. And and if you have a bad year, that would be extra bad. The emperor sacrifices 500 bulls and then you just throw it away. That would be a real jerk move. Now, what happens is the emperors, as the head, perform some of the most important ceremonies, but there's actually like a high priest who actually, he knows how to do this stuff. The emperor is trained on how to do his part of these things. And he has the most essential role, one of which is like, every basically 1,000 years or so, we'll say, there's sort of like a mini century. Whenever they have one of those, around the time, you get a new emperor, but not necessarily, because they live about 1,000 years, but it's around it's 945 years to be exact. There's a ceremony, whoever the emperor is actually gives some of their blood to ensure the good harvests coming on. So and this is and it's not necessarily a pleasant ceremony. I won't go into too much detail of how they give up the blood, but it's a ceremony that's damaging physically, and it's not a little bit of blood; it's a good chunk of blood. And this is for the livelihood of all of their people, and so they interact in that way. And sometimes they give their own blood. That's why I like to focus that it's blood, not necessarily human sacrifice. Sometimes you give the blood of a cow, but you don't have to kill the whole cow. Like I said, they don't have cows, but whatever. Typically people, you give the blood, but you don't necessarily have to kill them every time.
Would they put a single prisoner through multiple blood sacrifices?
Probably not.
Probably not. One time and then what? Kill them or let them go?
It would depend. If you want to,
would they ever let somebody go?
Oh yeah, if they're not worth it. In a way, it's sort of a cultural insult. It's like, I'm sorry, you're not good enough for us to sacrifice to our gods. You can go home. And in a way, it's embarrassing to go home if you lose a war, because it means you weren't worth keeping. Now, if you're a warrior, they'll let you go because they have a lot of respect for warriors. If you're a woman or a laborer,
but if they have a lot of respect for, if they have a lot of respect for warriors, wouldn't they be a good sacrifice?
No, because if you're the guy who went into battle and killed 800,000 people but took no prisoners, you're an embarrassment upon your class. So you're not good enough to keep around. So they just send you home.
So because opposing warriors generally are going to be all about killing Mystratos as opposed to capturing Mystratos, the Mystratos have less respect for them.
Oh, most definitely.
Interesting.
Because it takes less skill. Any hooplehead, it's like any hooplehead, in today's terms, can shoot and kill someone.
Fair enough.
It takes more skill to take them prisoner. And to be able to get them back. It takes skill and people to do that. So a lot of times your clans of warriors work together to do this. Your greatest warriors are the ones who can bring home the most people. And if you're not great at doing that, you're probably part of the caravan bringing them back. And in a way, your clans get status based off of how many prisoners your clan brings back. The emperor would take an allotment of that, obviously, for the empire. And like I said, if you're captured but you're not a warrior, you're probably not going to be used for a sacrifice, but you're going to become a slave. It's the sad consequence of ancient cultures, unfortunately. But you're the jerk who's building the next, layer of the temple. In the city building episode, there were plazas. There's actually a pyramid on each plaza, and there are, there's 4 plazas that surround the central royal compound. There is 4 important religious ceremonies that take place on each of those every year. So when it comes to commerce, it's your 3rd season. At the height of the 3rd season, you do a ceremony that's for commerce. When it's commerce, you go to your or when it's harvest season, there's a religious ceremony that the emperor presides over, in the area overlooking the commons. That way he's essentially giving luck out to people who are farming. There's a formal ceremony, and every time they go to war, there's a ceremony at the temple overlooking the Warriors Plaza. And then there's an important religious festival every year, which overlooks the Priest Plaza. And so those 4 temples at the center of the walls, separating the royal compound from the 4 main plazas that surround it, all are used for, at least one religious ceremony every year. And the good thing is, if you're not a priest, if you're a commoner, one of the nice things about being a commoner in this society is you very rarely have to give blood. But guess what? If your household's struggling, you have to give your blood for your household. It'd be part of the magic. So the same way the emperor would do it for everyone, if your house is having a bad year, with your shop, you would probably sacrifice some of your blood to do that as well too. But most of the religious stuff day to day is you have an altar, somewhat to ancestors, but also to the gods. Ancestors are typically the ones you want to talk to because they're nicer, because they're family.
Now, these sacrifices on Earth, if you're talking about, Central America and a lot of stuff that occurred there, their sacrifices are just simply, a religious sacrifice. In your world, there's magic. So does them doing
not always.
Well, if they do,
there's an implied sympathetic magic. Yes.
What I'm saying is, if they do a ritual, can that generate a magical response?
I talked about spirit magic.
Right. So
that's specifically what rituals are meant to do in my world.
Okay. But
if you do them right.
Okay. So do they have an influence on whether it occurs or not?
Yes.
Or is it just up to the spirits to choose to spot?
The whole point of the ceremonies are to get the spirits to do your bidding. If you do them correctly, they will do your bidding. If you kind of fail, they'll probably just ignore you.
How do you know to do them right, and how do the spirits know you're doing them right?
Well, it depends on the spirit you get a hold of, and the ritual itself is basically formed over generations who figured out how to do it correctly. So you're taught it from watching.
So it's a little bit of a repetition and trial and error until something occurs
until you get it right, and then once you get it right, your family just keeps repeating it.
Gotcha.
If the ceremony is too hard, you would seek out a priest to do it, because you wouldn't want to do it. Because if you get it wrong, what's the flaw with spirit magic in my world? You can really annoy the spirits, and spirits.
Yeah, you incur wrath.
It could be like, oh, we're going to give you a bigger drought. Yeah. You can have an extra dry season. Oh, there are rats that found your grain. Oh, that's horrible. So there are risks to performing these ceremonies, but which is why you might employ a priest to help make sure you're doing it correctly. If you don't do it a lot, you might pay a priest to come over and perform it for you, even though your blood would probably be essential at some juncture in their ceremonies, in their spirit ceremonies. But yeah, these are all spirit magic ceremonies that happen. And the Mystratos do have an inherent magic nature to themselves. Pretty much culturally, they all know how to interact with spirits. So shamans are just better trained at it. They're your professional class. They're the ones that have the better traits. Inherent to them for doing it. They're better at it usually, or they have a rich parent who got them into the job. One of the, how that goes. That's how it goes. The same everywhere. Anything else culturally you want to delve into here?
I'm looking at our list here.
Well, a lot of that is sub notes. So,
well, I know, but I'm looking to see if something's going to inspire me. You do have a sub note here of mentioning metals. I mean, The only thing you really said about metals was like silver and gold, and that
silver and gold. They're traded a lot in, but they don't forge them, and that's one of the important cultural notes that we did talk about. Metal is not a huge thing. They don't use them for weapons.
Now, what about your final notation here? Do you want to get into that?
No. I have no idea what I have no idea what that even means. So
okay, fair enough.
But it would be a pretty topic, but I don't think it's worth it. So But yeah, so one of the things is if you ever get trapped in my world of Gardual,
avoid Mystere.
avoid the city of Mystere. And
Are there really any places in your world where you'd want to gravitate towards, like, avoid the gnomes, avoid the
definitely stay away from the gnomes. Like,
stay away from the Siren.
The good thing is if you come as a trader, they're probably not going to screw with you, right?
Yeah. I mean, is that
so?
Right?
It's definitely much better. Oh yeah,
you don't say it in a way that I believe you. They're not going to screw with you.
They're probably not, because the thing is they don't want to discourage trade. Yeah. Trade's important to them.
To the Mystere?
To the Mystere. Yeah. You probably use the rivers to come back and forth. You have to have a lot of resources to make it to their capital city because it's in the middle of a mountainous rainforest area that's hard to get to. So you're probably, most of the interaction with foreign traders happens outside, on the periphery, in the coastal settlements and further up north, where it's not quite as cut off as most of the rainforest area is from the rest of the world. But yeah, there's another race of people called the Niclairmore, which are cat people, which don't live around here, but do have somewhat of a cultural connection with the Mystere, and the fact that they both consider themselves the child of the same person. But that's probably for a different episode. So
yeah, I think you're going to branch off a little bit much.
Yeah.
All right. So what are our tasks today?
For your world building task, it's going to take, the last couple episodes we've been having you think about, creating cultures, take a new fantasy race, or a race that you haven't really thought out much of their culture, and just brainstorm their culture. What's the geography? What are the things that are going to impact their belief structures? Because really, yeah, I could spend a whole episode going over like cultural norms. But the thing is, a good culture, one, will always have contradictions, and two, it's fluid and it's situational. So, it's hard, and people get sometimes too fixated, like, but you said that they don't do this. They don't unless this. Like I say, like they don't have metal, but that's not true. Later on, they start using metal because of trade. As trade improves, they get more metal, and they start to see the benefit of metal arrows, and we're at war a lot, and these guys are trying to kill us, and, they're really good at killing, so we might want to use some of the metal weapons against them too. But we really suck at forging, so we better start trading. So things have a way of evolving and changing over time, but they're interesting people just because I like the inherent complexity about them, and it's purposeful. They have time. Why would they be in a rush? But at times they become in a rush. So it's a very interesting dichotomy of a group to look at. And now for your real world task, don't commit blood sacrifices.
I was going to say it's fair season where we live. So go out and go to a fair.
Yeah.
Go get some onion rings and fried dough.
Fried dough. What did I have? My apple cider mini donuts.
I was gonna say donuts, but I was like, no, fried dough is kind of more universal. But I do love
it's more universal. The Big E, there's like this great mini donut carnival thing. It's there in the same spot every year, and that's like the first thing my wife and I head to every year. We get a bucket of them. We eat them. Our son's had a couple now. We usually have a guest with us as well too. So we'll blame the guest and my son for eating most of the donuts, not me and my wife. But it's sort of a tradition, right? And everyone has your favorite fair food, So while you're not doing blood sacrifices, go to a fair.
Yeah, I've discovered recently that I at the very least have a gluten sensitivity, if not celiacs. I don't know.
Okay.
So
Fun fact.
I can't eat most of my favorite things.
If you don't have celiac, you probably don't really have a problem with gluten. Here's an interesting thing. My sister-in-law has been told the same thing, and really has to be very, very careful what she eats.
Because she has celiac or sensitivity?
Sensitivity.
Okay.
When she went to Italy,
yeah,
she just ate all of the food, had no issues.
Really?
Mm-hmm.
Because that exact circumstance is something that I have been lamenting. I can still eat it. It'll beat up on my stomach. And I don't know for a certainty if I have celiacs or just a sensitivity. I've just been experimenting with what I've been eating, and I've been noticing a pattern. And
it's
my wife and I want to
we grow the wheat now has changed so much that it's, especially if it's not made well, the bread, if it's made cheaply, and especially with American grains at this point,
it's very cheap.
It appears that people are reacting to crappy grain, not to wheat. And so they go to a place like Italy that has a huge importance on tradition. And it's very hard. If you don't do it a certain way, they won't even, you can't call that bread. You didn't do it this way. This is the way you do bread. Yeah. And if you're from this one spot, you can call yourself super bread, So she didn't have any issues eating. She had zero issues.
So
and she was there for, I think, 2 weeks.
That encourages me greatly, because if I go, I would just, even if I had celiacs, I'd be like, screw it. I'm dealing with it. I'm going to enjoy all that Italy has to offer and just, suffer.
And now it's anecdotal, so I don't know how true that is, but I've heard this anecdote from multiple people.
Nice.
And I would imagine in most of Europe, it's the same. The U.S. has different rules with how we can stuff. We have different rules for how we treat our food supply, which is great for creating food for when there are lean times.
Yes, we have abundance.
So great.
We have abundance, but our quality suffers.
But it's been improving, and I think you'll see a movement to improve it, because with wealth, you get to start being picky again. So I think more people are becoming more picky because more people are having sensitivities and those kinds of issues now. The foods that we love.
The thing is, though, the thing that makes me think that maybe I do have celiacs is, I've got both, and I still have more reading to do. I've got multiple friends that have celiacs. I've had a lot of discussions with them, including 2 people that I work with. And the thing is that even if you have celiacs, you might eat gluten and not have a reaction. Like my friend's son, he doesn't have a reaction every time he eats it. He's like, it can present as a sensitivity. But the problem is that if you just have a sensitivity, it's not actually doing damage to you. Whereas if you have celiacs, you're actually doing damage to your body. And eventually, if you do enough, they have to go in and, surgically remove parts of your digestive tract because you've done so much damage. So I would like to know specifically if I have the difference. So right now I've been experimenting with what I eat. The thing that makes me think I do have something going on, though, is because I've had food issues for most of my life, but mostly like, I would eat and then I'd have to be going to the bathroom. Like for a little while there, I was like, well, do I have Crohn's or is there an allergy that I'm just not aware of? And I was born lactose intolerant, which didn't get caught for a long time. Oh, wow. So I was very sick when I was first born.
I would imagine they keep feeding you
milk. Yeah, they kept feeding milk. They're like, why isn't he gaining weight? So they're like, well, put him on
more milk.
Give him more milk. Exactly. So for like 9 months, I didn't put on any weight, and they were like, something's really wrong here. And eventually my mom went to a different pediatrician. They put me on an all soy diet, and I started to thrive. Anyway, so because of that, and then in my 20s, I thought I was having a milk issue again. So I started eating Lactaid, and I noticed an improvement, but still not a perfect improvement. And I have always eaten a lot of bread-based and batter-based products. I never would have thought, I mean, I didn't know about it. Now, I mean, celiacs didn't come into my radar until only a few years ago. And only recently did I start to notice a correlation. So even just this morning, I was saying to my wife, I'm like, it's odd because we're eating breakfast and I'm having gluten-free bread with my eggs, and she's eating this awesome cheesy roll from the bakery down the way that is so good. And normally
she's being truly evil.
Well, I mean, look, I'm happy that
you could never. Yeah, I get it. Yeah.
So I'm eating my gluten-free bread, and I finished breakfast, and I'm just sitting there, and I'm like, here's the funny part about all this experimenting with what I'm eating and what I'm not eating and paying attention, is that right here and right now, I'm experiencing nothing. And that is what I'm noticing. Normally, I would expect my stomach to start rumbling, or I'm like, a little
at least a minor revolt. Yeah.
Some sort of revolt, but I thought, well, maybe that's just my body processing the food, and this is to be expected. Like, as my body just starting to break down what I've eaten, and that's what this is. No, when you eat, you should feel nothing. And I am just learning this and getting this now, and I feel stupid because I'm 43.
Well, the problem is, but you're based off of your experience.
Well, right. I'm not beating myself up too hard about it, but it's still kind of silly that I'm still trying to learn how to feed myself at this age.
This is the way it was explained from watching some documentary, which might or might not have been a good source.
Okay.
Is essentially you have in a complete thing of grain, there's like enzymes and proteins and all the stuff that make it up. A lot of the modern American ones, I think it's some of the enzymes that help you break it down are gone. And so we struggle to actually process the food. So if you get an older style of grain, it's more likely to be complete with all the enzymes. Or if it's sourdough, from what I understand.
You told me this once before.
Something about sourdough helps with that as well, too. But I'm not certain on either one of those things. And I'm not a scientist, so take it as fact, people, and go do it. Wait, no, don't.
No, do your own research.
Do your own research.
All right, thanks for listening.
Yep, see you next week. Thank you so much for listening to the World Builders Anvil.
We would love it if you would share the World Builders Anvil with 2 of your friends.
And so would they.
If they are unfamiliar with podcasts, then you get to introduce them to the wonderful world of podcasting.
Take them to Stitcher or iTunes, or best of all, just send them to our website, www.gardul.com.
That's GARDUL.com.
Now strike while the mithril's hot.